Good morning and welcome to our conference. I'm delighted to see so many people here today. As I say, it feels somewhat disconnected not being able to see people and seeing names. But that said, I'm glad to see so many names on my screen and for so many people to be here for what is going to be an insightful morning. So just a few things before we begin. I'm David Donaldson. I'm a Scottish traveller activist, and today I'll be hosting, chairing today's event. Today's event is being recorded, so I would ask that any questions that you do have for our delightful speakers throughout the day, if you can place that in the chat function. And I would ask speakers not to answer the questions until given the time and to answer verbally. That's just so that it can be recorded and so that people who couldn't make today's event can have a true insight from the questions as well. Yeah. If you have any questions, if you can do that, please contact Paz as well. As I say, today's event is being recorded, so if you have any questions about the recording, please do contact Paz straight after. Andy's also in the chat, so if you have any questions throughout the event, you can contact Andy, or if you have any queries or worries, you can contact him in the chat function throughout. He'll be there to support. So a little more about why we're doing this conference today. So during the current pandemic, we have seen Gypsy travellers face additional risks from COVID-19, particularly due to accessibility of services, lack of accommodation, and digital exclusion. We know that Gypsy travellers are more likely to have pre-existing health conditions and be at increased risk of poverty, fuel poverty, and food insecurity. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has compounded many of the existing inequalities faced by Gypsy traveller communities in Scotland. The Scottish Government and COSLA published their joint action plan on Gypsy travellers, which coincided with the Planning Scotland Bill in 2019. These of course play a big part in improving outcomes for Gypsy travellers across a wide range of areas, but these plans cannot work in silo. We need people behind them. That's why everyone is here today. Paz has been working with the Gypsy traveller community for many years to improve accessibility to the planning system and, importantly, to enable the traveller community to have greater awareness and influence in planning decisions and place decisions that impact their daily lives. Through various partnerships, Paz has been working with Gypsy travellers across Scotland to improve the understanding of how place can impact on health and well-being. This morning is about expanding those partnerships, empowering you with the information that you need, and ultimately creating momentum for change that will ensure Gypsy traveller needs are heard, seen, and actioned. Together we can create solutions, and we believe we can create better places for Scotland's Gypsy travellers. So that's a little bit about why we're here today. As I say, I'm delighted to see so many here, and we really do hope that today is much less about talking, but more about empowering you with the skills and knowledge that you need to make sure that we can action a better place for Gypsy travellers in Scotland. So without any further ado, I'm going to go into understanding Gypsy traveller needs, co-creating better places. So a little overview about the presentation I'm about to give and the three key points that I'm going to focus on. One, who are Scotland's Gypsy travellers? When we say these words, what are we actually meaning? Who are the people that we're talking about? How is place significant to Gypsy traveller communities? I'm going to introduce to you what I term the Trinity of place and why I believe that certain places are specifically significant, but equally we need to ensure that Gypsy traveller voice is present within all place planning. And lastly, how can we take an equality-led approach to need? So I'm going to try and give you some skills, some practical skills, and some knowledge and insight into how we can take an equality-led approach to the needs of our Gypsy traveller communities. So to begin with, who are Gypsy travellers? And I'm sure many of you on this call have used these words and have used this terminology perhaps on a daily basis within your role. But also I'm aware that we very rarely actually explore that term. What does that term actually mean, and who are the people that we're talking about? So the term Gypsy traveller hides a lot of meaning. There are many communities that are homogenised within this terminology, and it's important that when we're discussing needs, when we're discussing engaging with Gypsy traveller communities, that we do appreciate that it's communities, because often we can have very different needs, and needs can vary massively on geography or on family, and so it's important we understand who we're talking to and the place which they're coming from. So to summarise the main groups of people who come under this terminology, we have Scottish travellers who are Indigenous to Scotland. Since records began, we've had Scottish travellers here. In our own language, we are the Naken. You have the Irish travellers who are vastly considered Indigenous to Ireland, and in their own language, they're the Pavi or the Minker. You have the Romani Gypsies who originate in northern India in the Punjab region, but many Romani Gypsies, of course, live in Britain today, having travelled here in the 1500s. So they have a long history in the UK as well. Welsh Gypsies, as the name suggests, many come back to Wales, their family units, but actually they're an earlier migration from France. And lastly, you have the French Manouche, who, again, as the name suggests, primarily live within Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, but they do travel seasonally throughout Scotland. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just to give you an insight into the main groups and the main demographics that we're talking about when we use this terminology. So a little bit about how we have had a relationship with place in Scotland, and I suppose how place has had a relationship with us throughout time. What I've done here is I've gathered together some key historical points that evidence how, not only how Gypsy travellers have been treated in Scotland, but more importantly, how our relationship with the land and the landscape and with place has been curtailed or perhaps not understood in the past. So in 1100, we had travelling tinkers first mentioned in King David's Farenman laws. Now, these were a set of laws which were put in place to protect travelling salespeople primarily. But what they did do was they set apart a section which described the travelling tinklers as a whole group in and of themselves, separate to just travelling salespeople. And so what this record does is it doesn't only show us how our relationship with travelling and with place was first ever recorded, but it also shows that the distinct recognition from King David and then his laws that we were separate, that we did have a group, and we were much more of a social group rather than a trade or occupation. Then in 1505, you had the first ever record of a gypsy in Britain, and this happened in Stirling. And King James IV met, the story goes, King James IV met a band of gypsies, as they were then termed Egyptians. And upon meeting them, he had a discussion with them and he gave them some money. My family story is that they helped him with his wagon. They helped him put his wheel back on. We don't know exactly, although there are records of him giving, I think it was 7 shillings or whatever the currency would have been, to what he then termed the Gypsy King, the King of Little Egypt. And so that again places Gypsy history to Stirling locally, but again, it is the first ever record of a gypsy in the UK. Now, in the 1570s, we started to see a new wave of legislation which was much more persecuting of travellers' way of life, of their culture, but most importantly, of their travelling and their relationship with place. So in the 1570s, we saw many acts, one of them the Egyptians Act, which led to Scottish travellers being ordered to stop travelling or to leave Scotland. Then throughout the time, we then started to see travellers, the language shift, and they started to be termed more as vagabonds, again tying their relationship with place and itinerancy with a negative. And so up until this point, it's important we recognise that the country had quite a benign relationship with travellers, their nomadism and their relationship with place. But in the 1560s, 1570s, we started to see that change and move to a much more hostile place. Then in 1704, we had the last known travellers hanged for the then crime of being vagabonds. And these were 2 gypsy traveller women, and they were hung at the grass market, and one of them was sadly pregnant. But it shows you the barbarity that did follow us throughout these legislations. 1714, we started to see travellers from across country being forcibly sent abroad. There are records in 1714 of at least 10 gypsy travellers being sent to a slave plantation in Virginia. So we did again see the state pushing us away. And again, the key issue to that, or the core issue to that, was our nomadism and our relationship with place. Now, the last piece of history I'd like to share with you is the 1895 report. Now, this was a report conducted by the state and the church into what they termed the tinker problem. Now, it came out with many different recommendations, but the key recommendation that came from that report was eradication is the only cure. And what they meant by this was they didn't believe there was any hope for adult gypsy travellers. They believed they were too stuck within their primitive way of life, as they termed it, but that there was hope for the children. And so they came out of a variety of different methods of catalysing on this hope. And the key method was if they removed gypsy traveller children from their families, removed them from what they saw as a primitive lifestyle, then the children would grow up to be reformed people, that's how they put it. And so from 1895 right on until relatively recently, the early 70s, we have records, we had gypsy traveller children being removed from their families, with the principal reason being nomadism and the relationship with place. So as you can see, our historical relationship with place has not only been persecuted, but it's been massively misunderstood. And so we come at a time within this conference that really what we're doing is we're disentangling centuries of misunderstanding, centuries of not being heard, but importantly, centuries of misconduct really towards travellers, that we are now in a place where we can support gypsy travellers to, one, realise the relationship with place on a national context, but equally, how can we take this history, turn it on its head, and actually move forward as a progressive country. So to introduce that, I have this, and what I term this is the Trinity of Place. And so what this is the three key ways in which the gypsy traveller community have a relationship with place in my eyes. Now, the first way is heritage, second way is health, and the third is safety. And what I seek to set out within this presentation is that you need to have an understanding of all three in order to understand how gypsy travellers engage with place and engage with their landscape. But equally, when we are taking part in place planning activities, when we are thinking about legislation and needs around place, we need to consider all three in their due respect. So to begin with, heritage. What does heritage mean? And what do I mean by this in terms of relationship with place? Now, many gypsy travellers talk about the old ways. Indeed, if you speak to a lot of our older people in our community, they'll talk about the old ways being gone or the old ways being dead. And that's something I'll return to later on. And, oh no, sorry, Andy, I thought you were talking to me, but it's other David. And that's a crucial point. It's something I'll return to later on when I discuss community views. But the heritage and the cultural needs of gypsy travellers in terms of how they engage with place is crucial. So, of course, coming from a traditionally nomadic place, gypsy traveller communities have a unique relationship with not only the landscape, but with physical spots throughout the country, termed to be called stopping places or camps. Now, these spots are crucial not only to our own identity and how we frame our identity within Scotland, how we frame our belonging, but crucially how we learn about our own history and our own heritage. So gypsy travellers, there's no book of gypsy traveller history, there's no place we can turn to as young gypsy Apologies for that. I'm back now. Seems I lost internet connection and was kicked off the stage. Right, okay. Apologies for that. Took up a little bit of time, but yeah, where was I? So heritage and place, it's crucial that we understand places not only as accommodation for Gypsy travellers, but also as the ways and means that they learn about themselves, to learn about their identity, and their identity becomes bounded within Scotland. So these places are where we learn our ancestral stories, be that histories of our own family or genealogy, but equally histories of our people through stories and songs and events. So we do have events throughout the country that we do also attend, and these are bound within our identity and crucial to our understanding of heritage. The second point is health. Now, when we talk about health and we talk about place, and I'm aware that some of our speakers are going to touch on this more than I will today as well, we need to discuss the inequalities that Gypsy travellers face when it comes to mental well-being, but also physical well-being. So we know that Gypsy travellers suffer from very high depression rates, very high suicide rates, and anecdotally we know as well that there are high rates of anxiety within the community as well. Now, a lot of that, I believe, is bounded within place. It's bounded within having a safe and stable place, but also having a connection with place and being allowed to explore that connection with place. Of course, we have physical health inequalities as well, including a lower life expectancy and higher infant mortality rates. Now, a lot of that is to do with the types of places that we're allowed to stay. Now, a lot of our traditional camps have been blocked off, and a lot of families without any permanent accommodation on offer from local authorities, they have to stay within often unsafe places. So at the sides of roads, in lay-bys on busy roads. Just a couple of winters ago, I heard of a mother with 2 young children staying on a little motorway. So these types of things aren't uncommon, but they are a symptom of not having enough accommodation in Scotland for Gypsy travellers. Sorry if I feel like I'm rushing, I'm just conscious of time now because I cut off. But the last element of the Trinity is safety. So I hinted at having a safe and stable home is something that we all need, right, for our own mental well-being, but equally for our access to services. So a lot of travellers don't have a permanent address, and because of that, they face multiple barriers when it comes to accessing services, when it comes to really being treated as a human, right? I mean, when we talk about difficulties accessing GP surgeries, for example, and the difficulty when you don't have a permanent address, trying to explain that to people on a front desk, it's often a very degrading experience for people. You know, you get treated in a, I can't put it into words, but in a way that you would never otherwise be treated. And so we need to think about not only is it accessing the service which is blocked, but it's the pathway to accessing that service is also fraught with mental turmoil. It's fraught with impacts and negative impacts upon your own mental well-being. So what I've put here is the cycle. I'm aware that Paz has a similar cycle. This to me sums up the issues when it comes to having a safe and stable home. So we start with a point of travellers being homeless. So that may be travellers without a temporary stopping place or without a permanent site. We then go to possible accommodation as identified, be that perhaps building a site in a local area. Local residents tend to fear negative stereotypes and they campaign. I'm yet to hear of a site that's been built in Scotland for Gypsy travellers where there hasn't been a local resident campaign against it. Now, a lot of that is characterised by media representation of Gypsy travellers, and it is fear more than anything else. Now, what that results in is a lack of support for travellers, perhaps from local leaders, local councillors perhaps not voting for it, or a lack of support in the media, and again propagating those negative attitudes towards what a potential site could be. And that results in permission rarely being granted, and then we go again. So there's been travellers stuck in that cycle for decades. As a community, we've been stuck in it, but even more so, there's been specific Gypsy traveller families who have been struggling to get planning permission for years and years. And so even after finding the money, even after finding a place to sit site, they're still fraught with issues in terms of getting a permanent address and in terms of getting it passed. So that is the Trinity, and I'm sorry if it felt a bit rushed. I'm just aware that I don't want to eat into speakers' time too much. Importantly, what I'm keen is not only to share that knowledge with you, but how can we put that knowledge in practice, and how can we better understand Gypsy traveller needs? The first point I'm going to share is personal bias. Now, the two key points in this is that we represent prejudice in a different way. Up until now, we've represented prejudice in a way that it's inherently negative. And what I advocate instead is that we look at prejudice and we think about how it becomes part of us, right? When we're brought up, you might have certain attitudes or certain stereotypes that become ingrained within how you see the world, and that could be in terms of how you see Gypsy travellers as well. But having that prejudice isn't necessarily negative. What the negative is not acknowledging that prejudice and then not challenging it. So the way in which you challenge it is seek first to understand, then to be understood. Don't approach Gypsy travellers trying to put, or any community for that instance, trying to put your ontology, your worldview upon them. Instead, understand their context, where they're coming from, and then seek to be understood. Because what we can often do is we can have an offensive approach and it become quite hostile, and a lot of barriers get put up if we go in there and try and put a different worldview on people automatically. Consciously separate the person and the issue. And what I mean by that is think about your approach, think about how you're seeking to engage or why you're seeking to engage, and then think about if it wasn't the Gypsy traveller community and you could replace it with another ethnic minority, perhaps with the Jewish community, for example, how would that differ? Would it differ or would it be the same? Because what that can do is it can uncover what we call the last acceptable racism, and that is the unconscious bias that we may have to approaching Gypsy traveller engagement without otherwise recognising it. So when we're talking about engagement, really this can be summed up with replacing a shove with a handshake. Always ask, what do I not know yet? That's where you should begin. And I believe these principles stick with any community, but especially with the Gypsy traveller community who do face multiple inequalities, who may have been evicted multiple times prior to coming into your area. What do you not know yet? What are the needs on that site? What are the needs on that camp? What are the needs of these families? Don't assume, explore. So again, you may have all the best intentions in the world, but don't assume needs. Always explore it with individual people that you're working with. As I said, Gypsy travellers are an array of different communities, and because of that, they all have different needs. Each family unit might have a very different approach to needs as well. When you're exploring that, you may come across barriers to engagement. I touched on the history of persecution that Gypsy travellers have faced. That is very much the tip of the iceberg that I shared. But because of that, there tends to be a mistrust of authority. And to be honest, that mistrust of authority saved lives in the past where Gypsy traveller children were being removed and where travellers were facing persecution. That mistrust was crucial. And so we need to explore, think about those barriers and how we can take them down co-productively with the community. And who engages, and is it proportionate? So I hear horror stories of local authorities with their first approach being the police and social work, going down to Gypsy traveller camps and taking a very heavy-handed approach, very uniformed approach to families. Of course, that scares families off. It builds those barriers. And to be honest, it's not proportionate. What I always say is when you're engaging with Gypsy traveller communities, when you're assessing needs, treat Gypsy travellers the same way you would treat anyone else. So if you were going down into a housing estate and speaking to a family there, take the exact same approach to going down onto a camp and speaking with families there. Practice with inequality frameworks. I'm not going to take up too much time on this, but what's in this is to take a rights-based approach. And I'm sure that that's a trigger word for many people on this call, but I really can't stress enough how important it is. This is a quick wee diagram. You'll get all of these slides afterwards anyway, but it's a really crucial tool in thinking about how rights are being met, and if they're not being met, how can we make that happen? So think about UNCHR, think about the Equality Act 2010, acknowledge that, you know, when we're talking about Gypsy traveller communities, we're talking about ethnic groups, we're not talking about lifestyle choices, and really think about how we can take a rights-based approach and a public health approach as well to inequalities that exist on roadside encampments or for our Gypsy traveller communities in our areas. So lastly, just to recap, the led approach that I'm advocating is it starts with a partnership. It starts with an appreciation of intersectionality. And what I mean by that is, think about Gypsy travellers as more than one thing, right? We're all more than one thing. I'm a husband, I'm a man, I'm a Gypsy traveller. You know, we all have multiple elements to our identities. But often what can happen when we're engaging and when we're assessing the needs of Gypsy travellers is we focus solely on the fact that they're a Gypsy traveller, perhaps not even considering the fact that they may also be pregnant, or they may also face issues when it comes to education, or, you know, all elements are crucial when it comes to understanding the needs of specific people and specific families that we're working with. Consider who has power. More times than not, we go into relationships with Gypsy travellers not acknowledging that the Gypsy traveller in that relationship doesn't feel that they have any. We need to ensure that when we're engaging with communities that we're doing it on their terms, but equally that we're making that engagement meaningful and empowering for them. How can we ensure that both the Gypsy traveller stakeholder and the local authority stakeholder, for example, has power equally? And so we're not taking this top-down approach, but it's much more co-productive, and that in its own way will take down some of the barriers. Focus on dialogue and engagement. So when we're talking about dialogue, we're talking about negotiation. Okay, I'm not going to focus too much on that, but the key thing when we talk about dialogue is it's a negotiation of needs, right? Local authority may have a specific need surrounding that encampment, perhaps it's in the wrong area, just to take one example. But equally, the Gypsy traveller communities will have needs within that area. They will have specific pressures on them as well. We need it to be a negotiation. We need it to be a dialogue between peoples rather than telling communities what to do. That's the crucial element to engagement. And lastly, explore the local community. Are you considering the needs of everyone? And what I mean by that is when we discuss local communities, when we use that word local, very rarely do people consider Gypsy traveller communities and Gypsy traveller needs. But actually, you know, Gypsy traveller families travel in certain areas. Families will go back to the exact same area year after year after year, perhaps even the same month of that year annually. And we need to think about what local means. Local also means Gypsy travellers who may travel through that area every June, for example. And we need to make sure that any place plans that we do, any insights into how place is used and how the landscape should operate and reflect the needs of a local community should also reflect the needs of Gypsy traveller communities. So that's a very whirlwind tour of some of the points that I think are crucial to understand when it comes to the needs of place and Gypsy travellers. My contact details are there, so please do afterwards. Andy will share all of these slides. Apologies for the slight technical hiccup and the eating into the next time, Petra as well. But without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Petra to come in with her presentation on why place matters. And Petra is the CEO of PAS. Thank you.
Hello and good morning. David, that's quite a hard act to follow. I really enjoyed that presentation. There's so many facts in there. That was amazing. I just wanted to quickly give you a tour about the work we're doing within the organization and also why we're doing it importantly, and then maybe end up with a personal observation as well. So, place matters, as we've said and heard before from David, and it matters because this is the organization. First of all, I want to introduce the charity. So we are a charity and a social enterprise, and for the last 25 years, we've been helping individuals to get involved in the planning system in a proactive and positive way. We're volunteer-led. We have over 400 volunteers, and they help members of the community to engage in understanding what is required. Skills training and advice is the primary source. We very much adopted a Patrick Geddes, a Gedesian approach to place. So we are starting, place has to start off with the folk in the place. And then we want to have this virtual circle where the way we create our places is then how our places shape us. And that's very, very important for all of the communities. So it is about what is place leaving in us and with us. So we have in last year, we did a work that was funded by NHS Scotland, looking at a place standard project and looking how that works for Gypsy traveller community. And there were some really interesting finding. We worked in 4 local authority areas. There was particular emphasis on how the engagement, as Davy mentioned, about with services. How was the engagement working for Gypsy travellers when they engage with National Health Services or in the local area board? And actually finding out what really means for Gypsy traveller, what is for them very important to live in a place that they regard their own. And some of the key recommendations that came out was that there has to be an amendment to the place standard, which actually recognizes that the Gypsy traveller culture and lifestyle is needed in terms of needs to have recognition, but also to ensure that the place standard tool has the assessment of the Gypsy travel experience to temporary sites, because that's part of their traveling lifestyle, and we can't just leave that out. And also a much clearer understanding, as Davy already mentioned, about the culture and the lifestyle, and I'll touch on that later. And of course, much greater engagement. So what we would like to help with is to change the narrative about Gypsy travellers' historical and cultural connection to place. And on that, I just want to say one of the interesting, I've learned as much by engaging with the Gypsy traveller community now for the last, since 2013. What we've found is that actually there's learning for all of us. And I've learned in particular the importance of landscape by the Gypsy traveller community, but also when you look at the Gaelic language is obviously steeped in landscape as well. So I just want to, at some point, explore how these two come about and how they are connected. But again, the stories that we tell is important, and we also have to, sorry, just get a look back there. So we need to celebrate the historical and cultural connection to places. And as David said, the community has been here for hundreds of years. And we really need to start learning more about the connection between their lifestyle, their way of looking at place, and our own. And then, of course, we started the journey working with Gypsy traveller communities around about the Equal Opportunities Committee inquiry in 2013, where we gave evidence. And the report came out, we said the report demands urgent action. And the chair of that committee said, I'm determined the report will make a difference to a community that has been discriminated against for far too long. And I think these are very strong words. And I have to say there is a shift occurring now in Scotland, and I outlined some of those. The guides to the planning system, which came then out of that as a direct result, looking at different communities. As David said, there's no homogeneous Gypsy travel community. There are lots of aspects, lots of different ways. And what we found is that just like the settled community is not homogeneous, there are lots and lots of ways to be sensitive to the different needs. So these guides are trying to do that. We also included a very important group for the place agenda, the planning system. That's a guide for community councillors to be aware of their own responsibility, as well as for the elected members and the media, because the media is often seen as the kind of group that can really harness the them and us culture. Of course, digital, we're now living with a pandemic, and as already mentioned, we're not seeing the same access to digital connectivity across all communities, including the Gypsy traveller community. So we need to be really mindful of that and have to investigate further what are the negatives as we're moving to a more digital world, including in the planning system. The Planning Act Scotland has given us huge opportunities. It has included a new national framework, which will include climate change for the first time, and it will seek a parliamentary approval. So there's a lot to be said in making sure that our Gypsy traveller community feeds into that. And we welcome in particular the new duties for the first time to involve Gypsy travellers and children and young people. And the introduction of local place plan, which should also include the discussion from a settled community with an adjacent Gypsy traveller site to actually come together and talk together about how would they like to see the local place plan evolving. And then finally, I just want to end by saying this is the advice and help and support that PASS provides. On a personal level, I would say my experience growing up in Germany has given me an insight into the persecution of Gypsy travelers. And we were taught in school, to watch out for outing otherness, and rather than thinking we need to be all one humankind. So this, for me, shapes my narrative very much. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Petra. That was really interesting. I completely echo your final point there as well. I think it's a crucial point, actually, in terms of that otherness and how we all think about that within our own professional relationships and individual relationships with communities. I would now like to introduce Councillor Elena Whittam. Elena has been a key advocate for Gypsy traveller communities within COSLA, and indeed has been a crucial player within not only the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan, but within many of the supports that we've now been seeing for Gypsy traveller communities throughout the pandemic. So Elena is going to give us an insight into addressing accommodation needs of Scotland's Gypsy travellers.
Hi, thanks very much for that, Davy, and it was really interesting to listen to both yourself and Petra giving your contributions this morning. I had some technical hitches this morning with regards to not being able to print off what I'm going to speak to you about, so I'm actually going to read it off the screen. So apologies for that, but such is the way that we're working just now. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so very much for the opportunity to speak to you at today's event. What a year this has been, and it's important that my contribution reflects local government's response to the pandemic, but also underlines our commitment to tackling discrimination in all of its forms facing Scotland's Gypsy traveller communities. Way back in February 2019, all 32 leaders at COSLA unanimously endorsed our ongoing work to improve the outcomes for Scotland's Gypsy travellers. And this commitment has been reconsidered at COSLA leaders during the pandemic, where full agreement again has been given to prioritise this work going forward. We've all experienced the devastating impact of COVID-19, and this certainly hasn't missed Gypsy traveller families. Isolating in their own small groups kept them safe at the height of the pandemic, but as we all try to safely regain some form of normality, we now know that positive cases are being experienced by families across the country on sites and roadside. COVID has also negatively impacted the expected delivery of the National Action Plan, meaning that we're really not where we'd hoped that we would be. However, we have absolutely restarted our delivery with new energy and determination. COSLA leaders have renewed their commitment to taking all steps possible to ensure delivery of the action plan. We have held national events and have restarted our vital joint engagement with Gypsy traveller communities. We are especially keen to ensure effective involvement of the community in what has become a digital platform. And I know that this means that some will be disadvantaged without digital support. I want to touch on local government's commitment to keeping the community safe during COVID pandemic by ensuring all support is delivered with a public health and a human rights approach at the centre. So at the outset, we set up a multi-agency COVID-19 Gypsy Traveller Impact Group, and that was organised and met daily throughout the height of the virus. It was led by COSLA and involved partners from right across Scottish Government, health education, public health, Police Scotland, and lots of third sector organisations. And councils have supported the work of the group through disseminating invaluable information to Gypsy traveller residents and ensuring delivery of relevant information packs. We also quickly developed a joint framework to support Gypsy travellers throughout the pandemic. And this hopefully enabled Gypsy traveller roadside families to camp on identified safe pieces of land without the fear of eviction and with provision of adequate sanitation. COSLA continues to work with local authorities to support roadside camps in line with this framework. And this has highlighted the need to do specific work in identifying safe and appropriate land for roadside camps. Now, Davy spoke about the huge cultural importance of these places. And we're taking this forward as part of our negotiated stopping pilot. But for me, it also underlines the huge need for that strategic look at traditional stopping places. Local authorities have also put the framework into practice by direct engagement with families living roadside. So a few examples of what happens: providing adequate sanitation, providing supplies of drinking water, daily welfare checks, ensuring access to essential services such as health and education, engaging with private landowners to facilitate families to remain in situ, offering temporary pitches on official local authority sites, and identifying and securing land for the sole purpose of roadside encampments needing to self-isolate. And on local authorities' own sites, again, there was much work regarding welfare advice, welfare checks, provision of PPE, information leaflets, looking at spacing on the sites to ensure that people could self-isolate and keep themselves safe. And Davy touched on the issue of fuel poverty, and some sites were really proactive in terms of bypassing the electricity meters. And this was really important for people who perhaps didn't have the facilities on site to provide their top-ups for electricity. If anything, I must say at this point that there was a huge amount of work done, but we did not get this right everywhere. And some of the lived experience imparted at last week's ministerial working group has left me hugely frustrated and even more determined that we need to continue this vital work. If anything, the pandemic has underlined the archaic living conditions on far too many sites across Scotland. And I'm going to use that word as it was spoken by Virginia last week, and in the depth of her feeling and the experiences she described means it's the only word that's appropriate. Not having access to mail due to no site manager, not having access to power cards, and being singled out publicly as someone ill with the coronavirus made her feel that she should have had a plague cross painted on the door of her trailer. We also know that we have major issues with site safety, and this is not just for a handful of sites that have failed minimum standards. This goes for many of the sites that have passed. And this is why the £2 million capital investment monies made available by the Scottish Government are so very important. Prior to COVID, that announcement was made for the capital monies for improvements on local authority sites to go above and beyond the minimum standards. We've now resumed work to support participation in making sites better places to live through hosting a national event on the 1st of October. And thankfully, we had all 27 local authorities with site provision involved in that. And colleagues delivered talks on participatory budgeting and the use of the Place Standard tool to support Gypsy traveller engagement on local spends. And as Petra said before, and also Davy, the whole issue of place and using the Place Standard tools is vital to this work. We recognise that £2 million will only make a small dent in the improvements that are required. And we're working collaboratively with Scottish Government to ensure there's investment in more and better provision and better site design longer term. This is going to require a totally new approach to how we assess needs and demands, and how we include Gypsy travellers in local place plans, and how we fund this new approach. Something else that we're doing is our negotiated stopping pilot. COSA was privileged to host the launch event of a negotiated stopping pilot with a heartfelt presentation from Helen Jones of Leeds Gate, who's actually preparing for her pending retirement. Helen and her team down in Leeds helped several years ago to channel my frustrations in what sometimes feels like a monumental struggle, and she's been very invaluable. The event in August was attended by elected members and local authorities and representatives from 19 local authorities. We've set up a practice group, which is meeting monthly, and a multi-agency advisory group meeting bi-monthly. A detailed delivery plan for the 3 phases of the pilot has been developed to include local and national learning events, as well as a research component. And these are going to be really vital as we look to how we actually can collectively resource culturally appropriate accommodation going forward. And we're really happy to have been contacted by several members of Gypsy traveller communities who want to be involved in the pilot and who will hopefully become members of the advisory group. So far we've got East Ayrshire, my own authority, Perth and Kinross and Murray, and we've also got authorities in Dundee, Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City and Highland starting to come forward to take that work. So very important, this pilot, as we need to work with families roadside, council landowners and the city community to ensure that Scotland's Gypsy travellers can continue to live their lives as they have done so for thousands of years. And I'm hopeful that this approach will forge better relationships all round. The pandemic has made participation very difficult for the last 8 months. And as I said at the outset, we're not where we hoped to be. We're looking at achievable solutions to involve the community to a greater extent in the delivery of the plan, and we recognise this is vital in achieving effective change. MECOP, Gypsy Traveller Women's Voices Project, and causal policy and participation work via our fantastic officer Dominique Barr will be working collectively going forward to ensure that we have more voices, involvement to help us get it right and to promote regular feedback to the wider community. It is really important that we can hear the community's views regarding what actions we need to prioritise going forward and their ideas around being involved in decisions and the delivery of actions. More importantly, we need to ensure that Gypsy travellers have a space to tell us how they feel the delivery of the plan is impacting on their lives, where we're getting it right and where we're not getting it right. I want to finish up with a few thoughts. We have a handful of councillors who are stepping forward to be community champions of this work. This is something I've spoken about from the beginning. We need more of them. We need them to call out discrimination of Gypsy travellers in all of its guises, be that in policy, be that in funding streams, be that in posts in social media, be that planning decisions, or the toleration of intolerable standards on sites. There is no place for complacency. We must work together to ensure that we collectively right these wrongs. There's no place for archaic living conditions in a modern Scotland. We must collectively resource the creation of culturally appropriate accommodation for Gypsy travellers on par with our investment in housing for the settled community. We also need local planning policy to be proactive in its approach to those who seek to create their own family sites, and Petra touched on that. This means that we need concerted human rights work with our community councils and our planning committees. We have much to do, and not before time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Elena. That was massively insightful, and I completely echo everything that you've said. And I think the end point there that you ended on there is crucial. You know, we do need to all come together to make sure that, as you put it, archaic relations with Gypsy traveller communities are put to bed, and we see a much more progressive approach to working with communities in partnership. Our next speaker, I'm not sure if he is here yet. I'm looking at our list and I'm not seeing him. Andy can perhaps confirm, but I don't think he's here. Is he here, Andy? Kevin? Okay, he's due to log on at 11. Okay, what we may do then, seeing as we've got a little bit of time, I'm aware there's a couple of questions in the question box. Because Kevin Stewart is supposedly coming in at 11. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that, Andy. What we might do is we might answer those questions whilst we have the chance at the moment. So just quickly then, I suppose starting in chronological order, Petra, if you'd like to come in, we've got a question from David asking the Place Standard project, which local were involved? If you're still there, Petra. Oh, Petra's gone. Okay, well, okay, well, we'll get that answer to you, David, when she comes back. Oh, she's here.
Sorry about that. I was trying to mute myself. So yeah, we worked in 4 local authority areas, and the report, the full report, is available on our website, so you can take all the findings for you there. But the 4 local authorities were Perth and Kinross. They were in Renfrewshire, an area, Edinburgh City Council. So we really wanted to find some local authority areas who had private sites and some local authority areas who had local authority sites, even to understand what makes a difference when you own your own site, just like when you own your own house, to those houses where things are happening to you. So we wanted to understand that a little bit better. But the full report is available on our website to download.
Thanks for that, Petra, and I hope that answered your question as well, David. The next question again was from David, and it was touching on a report that I mentioned in my presentation, the 1895 report. So he asks, the 1895 report by State and Church, was this the UK government and Church of England or Church of Scotland? So it's crucial. The state in which I mentioned there was the UK. It was coming from Westminster. The specific department, I actually went and got the report so I can be very clear on this. The specific departmental committee was the Departmental Committee on Habitual Offenders, Vagrants, Beggars, Inebriates and Juvenile Delinquents. And that was in 1895, and they worked with the Church of Scotland. But we have to recognise as well that those weren't the only two. Right? It wasn't isolated to just that committee. It wasn't even isolated to just that one report. That was the catalyst. And what we saw throughout much of the early 1900s was other organisations and more legislation coming in as well. You know, there was some acts in the early 1900s that were particularly bad, including making it illegal for us to build our tents and making it illegal for children to travel. So a lot of this legislation made it very, very difficult for scholars to keep a cultural way of life. And because of that, many families did, they moved into houses, and we did have a lot of Gypsy traveller families giving up the culture because they felt that was the only way they could survive and live. But yeah, we also had big organisations involved in that. There's a lot of stuff online. If you are interested in looking more, the 1895 report is available online. But you'll also get a couple of pieces that have been written by Travellers Times around the forced migration of Gypsy traveller children as well. Really gives you an insight into some of the history. But to be honest, in the community, it's not perceived as just perceived as what happened to us, and it's still every day it's spoken, and these stories are lived within the community. So it's very important. But thank you for your questions, David. So we have, oh, is there a message here from Andy? Yeah, if anyone has any further questions before the Minister logs on, feel free to post them in the questions tab. We do have 5 minutes before Kevin's due to appear. So yeah, we've got a bit of time if you have any questions for the speakers that have came already, or indeed, oh, here we are. Apologies if I pronounced the name wrong. Irene? Okay. I'm working with a few Roma families who are illiterate and have poor English language skills. I was wondering if any of your speakers could signpost us to any literacy courses available to non-English speakers. And again, any of our speakers can come in on this as well, if we have any suggestions. No? Okay. Well, maybe, Irene, I will attempt to answer it. One of the hats that I wear, I'm the chairman of Romano Lav, a charity in Glasgow. I'm not sure where you're calling in from. It may well be Glasgow. Romano Lav would be a particularly good place to go to. They do work with Roma families primarily in Govan Hill, although they do have extensions from that into communities in Clydebank and further afield, calling from Aberdeen. I would signpost in terms of Aberdeen, GREC, Grampian Regional Quality Council. I would say the best bet for Aberdeen. There's no specific Roma service that I'm aware of in Aberdeen, so the Regional Quality Council may be your best bet for translation and English services as well. Thanks for your question, Irene. Okay. If there are, oh, here we are. Yeah, we've got some more. Yeah, Elena, sorry, you can come in. I didn't notice your message in the chat.
I don't know if my camera's on, but that's not really going to matter. I was just going to say the local authority in that area should have an English as a second language provision as well. So it might be that if you contact Aberdeenshire or Aberdeen City Council to inquire as to whether or not they have support. But I was actually going to say about the organisation Romano Lab that you spoke about, Davy, obviously that being the one that you chair, but definitely there should be ESOL provision within the local authority too.
Thanks for that, Elena. Oh, Petra, you're muted.
There's also a number of charities, maybe we can put that in the post when the material is set out, who work particularly to improve language skills of non-native speakers, if that helps. Children, yeah?
Definitely. No, I think that's crucial, and what today's about as well is it's about these signposting, it's about networking and creating these partnerships. Just to feedback on one of the comments in the chat as well from Carol, has anyone written a history of the travelling families? There's a lot of books out there, and Carol, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we don't have a comprehensive study of all of the history. The closest you'll get to, although it's specific to Scottish travellers, the closest you'll get to a comprehensive history is Way of the Wanderers by Jess Smith. It's a particularly good book. Again, it does touch on a lot of the elements of prejudice, but it ties it through her own biography as well, which is quite good. Other than that, there are other books, of course, around specific families. So, of course, you had famous families like the Stuarts of Blair, Till Doomsday in the Afternoon's quite good. There's other resources as well. But the issue that we have with resources is they're quite often not written members, especially when you go further back into the early 20th century. And they were written by a type of people we call gypsyologists. Some of the academics will be familiar with that terminology. But because of that, they were done through a certain lens, and they tended to either romanticize or make primitive the lifestyle of gypsy traveller and culture. That said, there's another good resource if you're involved in education, Till Doomsday in the Afternoon, it's called as well. It was made by Art. It's a very good, I'd say a very good education resource as well. Okay, I'm just going to check Andy is here. Again, I'm not seeing him, but I mean, perhaps it's a bit unfair of me to, it just turned 11. Is he here? But oh, and Carol, you've put in the chat there around ESOL literacies. Yeah, thanks for that, Carol. Oh, here we go. I mean, the key thing when we're talking about gypsy traveller communities is to understand the localised relations. And what I mean by that is we can talk about national history, we can talk about national heritage, which of course is all crucial. But what I would advocate much more than that is to, when you're engaging with gypsy travellers, to engage with your local families and to engage with their local relations with your local landscape. Because more and more, I think people are starting to acknowledge that localised is, in many ways, when you're engaging with gypsy travellers, the best way to go. Because there are so many differing needs, there are so many differing relations with the landscape as well. But when we are talking about history and heritage, there was very different approaches taken across the country. Even the 1895 report was acted on more explicitly in some areas than others. So, for example, in the far north, so in Caithness, we have reports that in the early 1900s, a lot of tents were burned. So the police would go on burning missions, as they called them, and they would burn people's bough camps down. So that forced a lot of families into caves to hide out, basically. But in other areas, such as Perthshire, families have it, for example, the Bobbin Mill, where families were forced into reserves. So very different approaches, and equally you had some local authorities where it wasn't at all. So I think we can also fall into the mistake of homogenising history too much. Go on, Elena, yeah.
Thanks. Just Fabian, some of you know that I grew up in Canada. We use the word reserves there. That's how I've always viewed the sites that we have. I view it in the same way, where we've actually forced people onto something, land that's perhaps not the best piece of land, because those in power took the best pieces of land and with access to traditional land rights of gypsy travellers, or indeed First Nations over in Canada. So I think that the things are very interrelated. And just a thought that I have in terms of how we go forward to assess need. There's been an absolute absence and real understanding of the accommodation needs and demands of gypsy traveller communities. And that's a huge piece of work that we've pushed. The Scottish Government's given CAUSA some money for the research needed for that, which is really welcome, because I think that gypsy travellers are very absent in terms of their space within that analysis. So I look forward to seeing that work happen, so we actually understand what the funding is that we're going to need and how we're going to actually address that going forward. So just a few thoughts, but there's the minister here. So
definitely. Thank you very much for that, Elena. And it feeds on perfectly into Kevin, of course, who will give us the Scottish Government perspective on perhaps some of the issues that you've raised. So I'd like to introduce Kevin Stewart, MSP, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning. Thanks for joining us again, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Davy. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm delighted to be able to speak at this event today. I recall opening the same event last year. However, I'm sure that none of us could have predicted the challenges that we have faced during the course of that intervening period. This has been a difficult time for everyone, but I know that that is certainly true of some folks in the Gypsy traveller community especially. So at the start of the pandemic, working with COSLA and with others, we published a joint framework for decision making, helping local authorities and their partners to ensure that Gypsy traveller communities had access to vital support services. We also work with COSLA and the third sector through a multi-agency COVID-19 Gypsy Traveller Action Group. And this was set up and led jointly by COSLA and the Scottish Government with contributions from Public Health, Education, Police Scotland, and of course, vitally, the third sector. And a key part of their work has been to focus on communication with Gypsy travellers and to make sure that folks have the information that they need. And this has been partly through a Facebook page hosted by Article 12, but also through public health posters and leaflets. And the action group continues to work together to try to address issues faced by the community. And this will be particularly important as we all face new restrictions. The framework was underpinned by a £350 million community support package aimed at helping high-risk communities to comply with health guidance, to avoid increased poverty, and to bolster community resilience. And the Scottish Government provided £150,000 of specific support for Gypsy traveller communities during the initial lockdown. Over £70,000 was allocated to additional sanitation provisions for roadside public and private sites, and this included 36 toilets and 4 shower units nationwide. And £76,000 funded a number of third sector run projects for Gypsy travellers, including tailored financial advice and support, telephone-based counselling support for those identified as being at high levels of mental distress, and additional work to enable young people and their families engaging with Gypsy traveller education services to continue to maintain contact during the restrictions. In parallel with the response to COVID-19, we have also been working on the joint Scottish Government and COSLA action plan, Improving Lives of Gypsy Travellers 2019 to 2021. And this work is key to making a difference in the longer term, ensuring enough accommodation and suitable locations, well-maintained facilities, and of course, vitally again, with access to appropriate services. And the ministerial working group that established the action plan met last week to review progress 1 year on from publication. Unfortunately, we would have all liked to have moved further on than we have, but the pandemic has meant that we have not made as much progress as we would have all liked. And we heard from some members of the community firsthand about some of the struggles that they have faced this year. We will continue to work to support the community over the coming months, which are undoubtedly going to continue to be tough for everyone. However, I would like to tell you about some of the progress that we have made on the action plan, focusing on the accommodation actions. Some of those give me cause for optimism, and I'm sure that we can achieve a lot of what we initially set out to do, although some of that work may take a little bit longer. There are a number of actions in the process of being implemented that I hope will make a real difference to the lives of our Gypsy traveller community. In March of this year, £2 million was allocated to local authorities for the 2020-21 financial year to make immediate improvements above minimum standards to Gypsy traveller sites. After a delay due to COVID, COSLA held an event on the 1st of October to support local authorities considering methods for working alongside Gypsy travellers to plan how to best use their share of the funding to make immediate improvements on sites. Local authorities have begun to draw down the funding, and we know that others are making plans but have not yet claimed. And we have emphasised the importance of progress in spending to make improvements to sites despite the challenges. My clarion call to local authorities is that we are now back to helping folks in homes in terms of refurbishments and repairs. And if we can do that for folks in fixed housing, we can also do that for our Gypsy traveller communities. Safe ways can be found to engage with residents and to carry out work. Residents on sites should be hearing from site providers about how to get involved in deciding priorities for these improvements. And we all want to ensure that in future, Gypsy traveller accommodation is appropriately and collectively resourced. While the £2 million will help make improvements in the short term, the plan also recognises the need to look at how improvements continue in the longer term. And the government has recommitted to the action plan commitment on appropriate and collective resourcing in this year's programme for government. Jointly with COSLA, we're undertaking scoping work on funding needs and options. And we're also looking at individual funding streams to understand the possible barriers for Gypsy traveller communities in accessing those funding streams. Various strands of work on better understanding need have been impacted without doubt by these restrictions. However, we have carried out an evidence review to inform this work as we move forward, which was published on the 23rd of October. And we want to ensure that we have a housing system that works for us all. And our Housing to 2040 visions and the principles that back that up recognises the need for less traditional forms of accommodation, such as culturally appropriate accommodation for Gypsy travellers that meets the needs and the aspirations of the community. It is without doubt disappointing that a small number of site providers still do not meet the minimum site standards, and the Scottish Housing Regulator will continue to engage with those authorities on outstanding issues. However, I am pleased to be able to tell you about work that is underway to improve the quality of sites beyond the minimum standards. A subgroup of our Accommodation Action stakeholder group was established to consider how best to do this and met for the first time at the end of July. The group is focusing on developing a design guide for Gypsy traveller sites that will guide future investment in existing and new sites to drive up quality. And looking to the future, we need to look at the opportunities, for example, from modern methods of construction, so that Gypsy travellers can have the warm, affordable and accessible homes that meets their needs. Unfortunately, the workshops that were planned with the community that would have informed this work did not go ahead, but we will find, without doubt, other ways to engage with the community while we are developing the guide. And we'll let the community know how to get involved in this work. I also welcome the negotiated stopping pilot launched by COSLA on 1st of September, which recognises the right to Gypsy travellers to travel. It's important that research and evaluation is built into the pilot to inform future provision and increase quality of life and access to services for Gypsy travellers living at roadside. Also, during the course of lockdown, the Fuel Bank Foundation, which has been funded by the Scottish Government to provide emergency top-ups for households with prepayment meters, developed a referral partnership with MECOP. This project has recently been extended to March 2021, and the value of each payment will increase from £30 to £49 at the start of November, in recognition of increased winter costs. This will continue to be a vitally important support to Gypsy traveller families over the coming months. Turning to planning, which I know will be a key interest for many of you. The Planning Scotland Act 2019 includes new duties for planning authorities to set out how they have engaged with Gypsy travellers in their local development plan evidence reports. They will also have to report on how they have met the accommodation needs of Gypsy travellers. And we will be consulting on the new development plan system in the new year. We're also currently reviewing our national planning policies, and we have been told that our policies should support a wider range of new and innovative delivery solutions, including for Gypsy travellers. National Planning Framework 4 will look at the development of Scotland out to 2050. And forming part of the development plan, it will be a key strand in ensuring that the current and future accommodation needs of Gypsy travellers are met. I want the voices of the Gypsy traveller community to inform the draft National Planning Framework. And we will be proactive in bringing those voices around the table early in the new year. I know that creating better places for Scotland's Gypsy travellers is essential to improving outcomes for the community across a range of other areas that are featured in the action plan. We need to ensure that we address health, education, and other services. And I look forward to continuing the work with everyone here today to ensure that all of that happens. The Scottish Government's commitment remains as focused as it was prior to the pandemic. And while there may be some delays in implementation of some of our ambitious plans, we will get there. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak to folks today, and I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kevin. Insightful as always, and I think crucial as well in terms of the intersections of place and all the links up with MPF4 crucially, and some of the local development place plans as well. We do have a couple of minutes before our next speaker, so if anyone does have any questions for Kevin, we do have a few minutes to do that. If you could just put them in the question box, and then that will allow Kevin to answer them verbally as well.
Don't be shy. Now we've got opportunity. Although some of you online were probably on the call with us the other day as well. Davey, you're never short of a question. You could throw one in while we're waiting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously, as always, I suppose I'm chairing this event, so I'll have to tone it back on the activism front. But as always, Kevin, I'm always crucially important to see how community voice is going to be emboldened within these processes. And obviously, you link to MPF4 and the impact of these localized engagements as well. But I suppose from the government's perspective, and I know we spoke about this at the Ministerial Working Group as well, but what would you see as the main approach the government's going to take in terms of ensuring that Gypsy Traveller voice is present within these decisions going forward, and crucially within the likes of MPF4?
Well, I think we, from the Ministerial Working Group, we have a commitment to ensure that Gypsy Traveller voices are heard. And I think that most folk would agree that those who have engaged have been listened to. But what we need to do is to embark on further work to hear even more voices from the Gypsy Traveller community as we move forward. Now, some of that is easy as far as I'm concerned, but one of the things which has frustrated me over recent years in particular is the fact that many politicians have not been engaging with Gypsy Traveller communities as much as they should. So I've got a challenge for you folks as well in terms of making sure that your voices are heard by challenging your politicians locally, whether that be councillors, whether that be MSPs, whether that be MPs. Because one of the things which shocked me in recent times was a year and a half or so back, I went to the Gypsy Traveller site in Clinterty in Aberdeen. And the official who works there, Amanda, who is excellent in my opinion, said to me that I'd been the first politician that had visited for a very long time, and the only person that had visited since I'd last visited that site when I was a councillor was Christian Allard, an MSP that served in the last Parliament. That's not good enough, because at the end of the day, councillors, MSPs should be engaging with all of their constituents, and that includes Gypsy Travellers. So please challenge your elected officials. Make sure that they live up to what our ambition is, and tell them exactly how it is, because your voices must be heard. I see a question from Petra. How do we facilitate a constructive dialogue with all the communities and a more proactive engagement with Gypsy Travellers? Well, I think I've kind of answered some of that. We have a very clear vision from the Ministerial Working Group. I know that Elena shares that vision from the COSLA side, but we have a job of work to do in ensuring that all of our colleagues also engage, because we need to make sure that all voices are heard. And some other communities have also been disenfranchised in the past, and some would argue that they still are. I don't think we hear enough of young people's voices when it comes to planning, for example, and our ambition is to change that by making much more use of digital technology to ensure that their voices are heard. So, we must ensure as we move forward that we're engaging with everyone, and we must ensure that those folks who have been disenfranchised in the past actually have their voices heard. Sometimes, in some cases, that will be for the first time.
Definitely. No, I think that's a very valuable point, Kevin. I don't know if Elena, judging on your comment there, if you'd like to come in, perhaps you have a question for Kevin as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing me in. Hi, Kevin. Hiya. Yes, I touched a little bit on this in my own contribution. I do agree with Kevin and Phoebe and Petri. This is something you're very passionate about as well. These voices have been missing from the whole process for so many years, hundreds of years, in fact. And I think that we're trying to unpick, how we actually and then decide going forward how we actually engage people. And I think a lot of the work that Dominique's going to be doing in her role, her role within CAUSA is about engagement. I think we need to look beyond just how we actually engage people in terms of what's happening right now. We actually have to engage members of the Gypsy traveller communities and how they see their place going forward. I think that the standards tool is going to be hugely important for all groups to be able to use. And Kevin, you touched on that there, young people as well. And I think that unless we bring people together, and this is something I know Petra, yours as a champion as I am about, we have to reach community councils. We have to reach the settled community. We have to bring the travel communities together with those segments of the population, because if we don't start to have that proactive, positive engagement across the different communities, we're not going to get to where we want to be. We're going to continue to see one-man band protests against a family trying to create their own sites. We'll continue to see locally elected members not willing to put their head above the parapet, and that's something that I touched on in my contribution as well. We're starting to have local champions coming forward. Obviously, the pandemic got in the way of that, but that's something that I want to make sure we increase, because if you have local politicians deciding that this is not acceptable, they're looking at that under the terms of human rights and equalities, then it becomes an unstoppable argument, and then it's no longer an argument. People are actually, in the funding streams, they're in the creation of policy, and we change the dialogue completely. So those are my hopes, and I think that they reflect Kevin's as well. It's going to take work, but I think going forward we can do it.
I didn't want to go back into history, but I will. And I'm sorry for boring some people who have heard me tell this story before. But many years ago, when I was in Aberdeen City Council, where there was quite a lot of conflict between the settled community and the Gypsy traveller community, which had been exacerbated by the local media, I thought the best thing to do would be to bring communities together. And I tried to get Aberdeen City Council and Aberdeenshire Council to host a summit, which they didn't and wouldn't do. I eventually won through because Grampian Police, at my behest, hosted that summit, which brought people together. And I think the key thing about all of that and the learning from that was that people recognised that they were not that much different from one another. And folks, in the main, want the same things. They want security, they want good public services, and they want the best for their families. That's what we all want. And while some folk choose to stay in settled accommodation all of the time, we have to understand that as a nation, our history has had a lot of folks who have chosen to travel during the course of that. Now, we need to bring communities together. We need strong politicians to put their heads above the parapet and to call out all of the nonsenses that sometimes appear in the media, or even to call out those politicians that try to lay blame at the door of Gypsy traveller communities for various things, which have often, in most cases, got nothing to do with Gypsy traveller communities. We must be brave, and we must ensure that we get rid of this last bastion of racism, and to provide Gypsy travellers with the same level of service that we expect for everyone else. That is my ambition, and I think that you will rise to that challenge as well, Elena. I've heard you challenging people before, but we must all do that. We must all do that because, as I said, what we have when we bring folk together is a greater level of understanding about what folks' needs and aspirations actually are.
Thank you very much for that, Kevin, and strong words from both yourself and Ina as well. And yes, no doubt that'll be backed up with action as well in the coming months through the action plan and other frames of work as well. Lena put in the chat there as well, community conversation events due to restart in December. That's all very good to hear. And as a community member myself, it's nice to hear that and to see politicians taking a stand as well, because I completely echo what you're saying, Kevin, and we need to see strong leadership behind this as well. Thank you both for joining us again. I now wish to bring in Emma Doyle. Emma's going to talk about place, health and well-being, so really feeding in on some of the points that Kevin made as well, around wanting a safe and healthy place for our families and friends. Emma Doyle is the Health Improvement Manager, Place Public Health Scotland. Thank you all very much.
Hi everyone, sorry it just took a minute to get on the stage there. We need to make space on the stage before someone can join. Andy, do you have my presentation there, please? Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so good morning everyone. My name is Emma Doyle and I'm a Health Improvement Manager at Public Health Scotland. Some of you may have seen me present some of this material before, so if you have, then I'm sorry, go and make a cup of tea or whatever while I go through some of the slides that you may have seen before, but hopefully it'll be new to most of you. So for those of you, okay, Andy, I'm not able to move my slides. I need to be given control of this. Ah, there we go. Oh, I still can't, so you're going to need to do it for me unless you can give me control of it, please. So Public Health Scotland, for those of you who aren't aware of us, is a new public health agency that was set up in April of this year. Perfect timing in the middle of a pandemic to set up a brand new public health agency, but it brings together what was formerly the Information Services Division of National Services Scotland and what was formerly NHS Health Scotland and also Health Protection Scotland. So we're the lead national agency for improving and protecting the health and well-being of all of Scotland's people. That means, when we say all of Scotland's people, that means including those who have the poorest health outcomes. So very much still about improving health inequalities. Next slide, please, Andy. The next slide, please. Thanks. So for those of you who don't know the definition of health inequalities, we're talking about unfair differences in health within the population across social groups and between different population groups. And it's really important to emphasize that these unfair differences are not random or by chance, and they're not inevitable. So they are socially determined and politically determined to a large extent by the sorts of decisions and policies that are put in place. They have a huge impact on the health inequalities. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of an old infographic, but it's, oh, sorry, back here. Right, so these are a bit, this is a bit of an old slide, but it's really helpful, I think, to give a picture of what we are talking about when we're talking about health inequalities, even within a city. So this is a transport map of Glasgow, and what we say is that for each station that you pass between Jordan Hill in the northwest of Glasgow down to Bridgeton, life expectancy for men drops by about 2 years and for women by about 1.2 years. So even within the city of Glasgow, there are huge disparities in life expectancy. So this slide is the life expectancy, male life expectancy in years across all of the community planning partnerships. So you can see that between Glasgow at the bottom of the graph and East Dunbartonshire at the top, there's quite a difference in life expectancy. And then within each, between the least deprived in the grey at the top and the most deprived in white, there's a huge gap in almost all local authorities. Some of the island authorities have very small numbers, so it's kind of hard to see the differences. But in some, you can see that there are huge disparities between the least and most deprived. And huge disparities between the different community planning partnerships, and the picture for women looks quite similar, and male is always a slightly stronger picture. And this is healthy life expectancy. So we're not just talking about years of life, but we're talking about years of life lived in good health. And it's also not just about the least and most deprived. This affects everybody. So all of us fall somewhere along the spectrum. So inequalities affect all of us. So these data are from 2015-16. And you can see that in the 10% most deprived areas, healthy life expectancy was 43.9 years, which is 26 years lower than the least deprived areas. And the gap is 22 years for women. So quite a huge gap in terms of healthy life expectancy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the health inequalities impacting Gypsy travellers in Scotland, for those of you who maybe aren't aware of some of the statistics around this. So we don't have very good data yet, still, unfortunately. This is something we're constantly working on. Gypsy traveller was included for the first time as a category in the 2011 census, which is the most recent census we have. The census is done every 10 years. Next year's one has been postponed because of the pandemic, so it will now be 2022. So the most recent data is from 2011, so a bit old. And in that census, just over 4,000 people identified themselves as a Gypsy traveller. And we know that that's a huge underestimate of the population in Scotland. And we're really hopeful that as people understand more about the importance of self-identifying in the census, people will have more confidence in the next census to tick the box that says Gypsy traveller. And the reason is that having this data gives us the information we need to make changes, and not having good data makes it harder than it needs to be to get changes made. So we hope we'll have better data next time. But on the basis of those 4,000 people, we were able to do some analysis. The Scottish Government analysed this data. And this is a population pyramid, it's called. It shows the different numbers of people in each group in each age band. And the population on the right-hand side is the population pyramid for Scotland, and that is kind of a standard population pyramid that you would see in a developed country, in a wealthy country, with people living into kind of older age. The one on the left is for Gypsy travellers, and you'll see much wider at the bottom and then tapering off very quickly. That's the sort of population pyramid that you usually see in a developing country, where people there's a high birth rate in younger ages, but people are dying very quickly, and tapering off, and fewer living to older age. So there's a real difference in that between the Gypsy traveller population and the general population pyramid for Scotland. The same analysis of the census also showed that Gypsy travellers experience poorer health. So this is the sort of people self-reported having a long-term limiting health problem or disability, and this is for women. And the line down the middle is the white Scottish rate, and you can see that for actually most ethnic minority groups, people have fewer disabilities or life-limiting or long-term limiting health problems than the white Scottish population. Bangladeshi and Pakistani women there have slightly more than the general population, and then the bottom line is Gypsy traveller population, which is twice the rate. And this is again self-reported general health, and people saying that they have bad or very bad health. And similarly, the most ethnic groups you can see report slightly better health than the white Scottish population. Bangladeshi and Pakistani women slightly worse again, but then the bottom, Gypsy travellers, which is more than 3.5 times the white Scottish rate of self-reported poor health. And despite this, this graph shows outpatient appointments, which is just one measure of health service use. And you can see there about 4 lines down, Gypsy traveller use of health services there in terms of outpatient appointments, quite a lot lower than most other ethnicity groups. So what causes health inequalities? And said that they are not random, these are socially determined. And we work on the basis of talking about health inequalities being caused by fundamental causes to global forces, political priorities, and societal values, unequal distribution of power, money, and resources. And these lead to unequal distribution of the wider environmental influences, such as economy, availability of work, availability of education, access to services, and that shapes individual experiences of these things, whether people can get a job, whether they can get access to learning, and whether they can access services. And the effects are inequalities in the distribution of health and well-being. And the reason I'm talking about this in the context of a presentation about place is that all of this, the availability of services, the access to work, access to learning, this all happens, as we know, in the context of a place. And when we talk about place, we're talking about the physical and social environment in which we live and the people that inhabit these spaces. So quality of life that comes from the interaction of people and their surroundings, people and physical spaces. And if you think yourself about the place where you live or the place where you work or play or spend a lot of your time, think about what that place is like and the aspects of it that have an impact on your own health and well-being, your sense of identity and your prosperity. So some of the things you might think about: do you have a sense of belonging? Do you have suitable accommodation, places to meet people, job opportunities, contact with nature, access to services? Do you feel safe and can you get around your place? All of those things will probably have a positive impact on your health and well-being. If you spend your time or live near derelict land, poorly maintained spaces, traffic with poor air quality, lots of noise, and you feel unsafe or isolated, that will have a negative impact on your health and well-being. And we know this, poor environments have a profound effect on people. We know that they can lead to poor mental health and poor physical health. And we know that they can lead to increased levels of hormones associated with stress, and that can then lead on to additional health problems, both physical and mental. So this is, there's lots of evidence about the impact of places on people. And if you think about some of the places that some Gypsy travellers live, I think we've all seen examples of those being places that would not have a good impact on health and well-being. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the place standard and then about how that's kind of being applied at the moment in relation to Gypsy travellers. So this is a whistle-stop tour for those of you who may not be familiar with the place standard, but there's much more in-depth information available if you want to look it up. So the place standard is a tool to assess the quality of new or existing places. It's designed to bring people together to assess and deliver high-quality places. It's designed to promote consistency across Scotland, so we can have consistent conversations about places and ensure that environments support us to live healthy and happy lives. The place standard is built around 14 themes, and these are all based on evidence of what we know promotes health and well-being in a place. So there's an evidence base behind all the themes. We've just revised the place standard. Actually, a couple of the names of the themes have changed, but they're substantively the same. It's for anyone: local residents, community groups, community planning partnerships. Anyone can use this tool. It's quite accessible, and it's designed to bring people together in a conversation. It can be used to design new places or to improve existing places. And the key thing about the place standard is that it puts local people and local experiences at the centre of the conversation. So it asks people to talk about how they feel about a place, what their experience of it is, what it's like to live in that place or work or spend time in that place, and what their own priorities are for improving the place. Using it is very simple. It's available online, or it's available as a kind of booklet, or we've got different formats. And it essentially asks for each theme a main question, and then it has a series of prompt questions to kind of get the conversation going, and they can be tailored to the specific circumstances that you find yourself in, the particular place or the particular priorities you might want to discuss. And then it asks people to give a score from 1 to 7 for how good they think the place is, and to try and reach some consensus around that score where possible. So you decide the score, you add it onto the tool, you join up the scores, and you get this kind of visual output that helps you to look at where the strengths and weaknesses of a place are. We always emphasize that the score is just it's about the conversation that you have to get to the scores. The scores are not meaningful in and of themselves. They just help to represent the kind of conversation, but it's the conversation that really matters, because that's where you hear what matters to people in a place. So as Petra mentioned, we used the place standard. We did a small pilot study to find out about the quality of Gypsy Traveller sites. And I'll just show you what the picture outputs look like for those sites. So the sites A and B were private sites in rural areas. And you can see that actually they scored quite highly on most of the themes and questions. So in site A, public transport scored quite low, but actually the residents of that site said it wasn't a priority for them because they had access to their own transport. So that's why knowing what's behind the scores really matters. And they also scored slightly lower on social interaction and identity and belonging. In the other site, that was a private site, they scored quite highly on most measures, but the one that they scored a bit lower on was influence and sense of control. And that was because they felt that their autonomy over their site was maybe under threat from council intervention. They had some concerns about that. And we also used it on 2 public sites in our near urban areas. And you'll see Site C scored quite low on quite a lot of axes, particularly care and maintenance. This is a site where residents reported fly and rat infestations, poorly designed amenity blocks, lighting not working, antisocial behaviour from outside the site. This is a site where renovations are already planned, but they did score it well in terms of access to natural space and access to off-site facilities and amenities. And then Site D had been recently refurbished. This was low on traffic and parking in streets and spaces because there was new development around the area where there was increased activity. And it also scored low on work and local economy. There wasn't good access to job opportunities in the area. But they did have a good sense of identity and belonging because they said that the residents said they celebrate their culture and they're proud of their homes. And it might be significant that Site D is a location where Gypsy travellers have traditionally camped. So it may be that it's already a place that people feel a connection with, and these conversations brought out the importance of that to people. So again, it's about what sits behind these scores that you really need to think about. So we found from the study that obviously what makes a good place or a poor place for Gypsy travellers is same as for everyone else, but there is more or different emphasis on some aspects of place, as Petra mentioned. So recognising the importance of associations between homes and spaces around those homes and workplaces to Gypsies and travellers is really important. Ensuring that the meaning and significance of identity and belonging is captured, and that that's done in a way that recognises the specific significance for Gypsy traveller culture and lifestyle. And recognising the importance of certain places and types of places and relationships to the land and nature. So it's about, again, using the tool and the prompts within it to have maybe a slightly more tailored conversation and to emphasise things that we know are more important. So Petra mentioned there have been some recommendations from that report, and we have been continuing the work since the report was published. It's helped us to improve awareness and understanding of the importance of both permanent and temporary places in Gypsy traveller culture, and think more about what makes a successful place for communities. We've been encouraging others to use the place standard or similar engagement tools to support Gypsies and travellers to get involved in the processes influencing and shaping their places. We're using this information to help the Scottish Government to review the minimum site standards, as the Minister mentioned, and look at other ways to improve permanent and temporary places where Gypsy travellers live. And we always need to be aware that it's not just about sites, and that Gypsy travellers who are settled or who live in housing for part of the year need to be involved in improving their places too. So one of the things that we've also been thinking about at the moment is how we can use the place standard tool in the context of the pandemic and the challenges, because it's very much designed as a face-to-face engagement tool. So we are thinking about ways of using it online, but obviously there are challenges with digital access and Wi-Fi access and things like that. So people in a number of local authority areas are also looking at how they could use community notice boards or different innovative types of engagement, smaller group work, outdoor work, walk-arounds, photographs, things like that. So we're really keen to engage with people who want to use it in innovative ways and to support that, but also to learn from people using the place standard at the moment. And Dominique has facilitated a conversation with people who are doing that, and she can put you in touch with others, or put you in touch with me, and I'll try and put you in touch with others if that's something that you'd be keen to try at the moment. So the Place Standard.scot website has the tool online and more resources in terms of how to use it. You can get in touch with me directly. My email address is there, or you can follow us on Twitter, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. That was massively insightful and, to be honest, quite shocking in places as well, hearing about the health inequalities. But crucial that that link's made, of course, between place and health and well-being. So thank you very much for that, Emma. Moving on now to Dom, actually. Dominique Barr is going to give us a case study. And Dominique Barr is the Policy and Participation Officer at Migration, Population and the Diversity Team at COSLA. So I'll pass over now to yourself, Dom. Apologies, Dom. It seems that you're muted and your camera's off as well. I don't know if you can give any technical support, Andy. Oh, there we go.
Oh. Is that us now? Brilliant. So apologies for that, folks. I was being a bit lazy and hoping that Andy was just taking the controls there. So I was just saying that, similar to Emma, apologies if anybody has heard this case study before. I've presented it once at our negotiated stop-in pilot, the launch of that. So the reason I've decided to repeat it today, I suppose, is because I really feel that it gives a kind of clear sense of the different impact that the Gypsy Traveller community experience when positive engagement or effective engagement happens. And it kind of gives a clear sense, I believe, in terms of the importance of place for Gypsy travellers, and particularly those living roadside in this experience. So I'm going to begin by giving a local authority perspective on this case study. So the roadside camp that we're speaking about here, there were 16 people within the encampment, made up of a kind of mix of adults and children, and there were 6 trailers. The camp was originally based on the grounds of an unused factory. The families had travelled across from Northern Ireland and they had returned to Dundee for 3 consecutive years. The council wasn't at the stage of having effective engagement at that point, but the travellers had always been respectful of the land that they had used whenever they had pitched up. One of the kind of key messages, I suppose, for this is that we can't assume to know what people need, and we have to have that conversation with them. We have to look at what is required for a particular group of individuals, and kind of different speakers have kind of touched on it, Davey touched on it, the kind of myriad of kind of different communities that are within, kind of under the umbrella, I suppose, of Gypsy Travellers. So we can't assume that each group that we're working alongside or that we're trying to engage with has got the same set of needs or the same kind of want to engage. So we have to take that into account, and we have to have that initial conversation. The council for this encampment during COVID tried to negotiate with the landowner to allow the installation of refuge and sanitation facilities. It was refused by the landowner, with the view that it would encourage the traveller group to stay longer and to return to their land, in fact, in the future again, which the landowner didn't want. everybody is entitled to that. This person owned the land, he is entitled to say who is on it and who isn't. The landowner continued to pursue an eviction order. The positive impact kind of aspect, I suppose, of COVID during that time was just as the country had went into lockdown and an imminent eviction order was looming, the encampment moved through the factory land and onto some waste ground which they felt was more appropriate for the group due to the lockdown restrictions. It allowed them to have more space to move around and have adequate space between their trailers. The family were concerned that they would be evicted from the current land. And I suppose this is where the council kind of stepped in, and a very effective and engaging Gypsy Traveller liaison officer began working alongside the family. He assured them that he would speak with the landowner and come back to them with a response. He was able to identify the potential welfare concerns that were around for the family. He discovered that there were 2 pregnant ladies within the group who he was also able to arrange maternity care for. They previously hadn't had this. He spoke with the landowner and they managed to negotiate their stay during the lockdown period and gained permission to install adequate sanitation facilities in the land, something that isn't a normal process. This allowed the council to supply toilets and bin collections to help with sanitation and prevent the contamination of the land. Environmental health protection was also a key factor, and that was obviously helped by the provision of adequate sanitation. The other aspect was about how were the families on the roadside camp going to maintain their kind of self-sufficient nature and something that is key again to the Gypsy Traveller community. So that was enabled by drinking water being provided and food parcels being provided for the encampment. The cost and the supply issues, the showers, discussed during meetings within the Scottish Government in COSLA, and it was agreed that the Scottish Government would source the fund that these facilities were recognising the immediate need that was around. I suppose what this story kind of showed was the flexibility and the recognition of immediacy and the need to kind of cut through the red tape and to supply facilities that were necessary for a family to stay safe during a major pandemic. The relationship between the community and the council at this point was at an all-time high. This was due to trust and insight. The trust was developed and the insight was gained into the lives of the families and their concerns for the present time and for their future. That's, I suppose, the local authority perspective. I wanted to kind of move on to speak about the traveller's perspective. And I have to say that these words aren't exactly those of the person speaking, but they are kind of taken from conversations that had taken place between the Gypsy Traveller liaison officer and the Gypsy Traveller women concerned. The Gypsy Traveller liaison officer recognised that we were a different group. We had different circumstances and we had different reasons for travelling. We were travelling part-time into Scotland for seasonal work. We've been coming to the same area for 3 years. We've come and gone, never knew or trusted who we could speak to. Most places we go tell us to move on straight away, or the locals don't want us there. We don't live the same, but we are human. We have to sneak onto land. It's not romantic and it's not picturesque with campfires, handkerchiefs round our necks and singing all the time. We have to live on industrial estates with lorries passing and camping beside us all night, strangers sleeping in the lorries and walking past our trailers. We have to live on motorways or by busy laybys, We live in car parks, or we live in the middle of nowhere, out of sight, with no shops, no toilets. The kids stay on the camp, strangers passing them by, name calling as they go. Our boys get into fights with older ones because they're trying to protect their younger siblings. We don't get schooling, we have nothing to do, and there's no local park for the kids. We need to be safe, and safety comes in numbers. That's why we stick together. I'm expecting a baby, and I needed to know where to go, needed to talk to someone who wouldn't judge me, and be able to access my records from Ireland. Some workers think we don't look after our children, and people I know have lost their kids. Yes, it's still happening. It's not just historical. This is why we're still fearful. Our men all mostly work for themselves, trying to make a living. They can't go to the tip because they don't have a permanent address. They get bad press and police asking lots of questions because he's someone who done a poor job a few years ago. We have no access to running water. We usually use the sports complexes or services for toilets and for showers. It would be great to be able to camp with our own facilities. We don't do this through choice. This is what my family have done for years, and I don't know anything else. This is who I am. I am a daughter, I am a sister, I am a mother, I am a wife, I am an auntie, I am a granny. We won't be here long, we will move on. We just want to do our work, look after our kids, and then shift to our next stopping place. Thankfully, our experience this year has been a Gypsy Traveller liaison officer who was able to be open and honest. He done what he said, and most importantly, he listened to us and he asked what we needed. Next year, we can come back with a new baby and someone we can trust to contact. So I just want to finish there. It's kind of short and brief, and I just hope that it's given some sense into the kind of difference that kind of negative living circumstances, negative engagement can have with the Gypsy Traveller families, and kind of against kind of more positive impact that kind of takes place. Thank you. I'm sorry, my husband is sorting my tea at the side of me.
Good enough.
Apologies for that.
Getting tea in that brought tea, that's something. But no, thank you very, very much for that, Dom. I think it was really valuable to hear that, actually, and to hear the real positive impacts that positive engagement can have, and the real life impact that can have for families. So thank you very much for sharing that. I'd now like to pass on to Dr. Lana Ireland. She is a lecturer in psychology at Glasgow Caledonian University. She's going to speak about fostering engagement between the Gypsy Traveller community and academia. So thank you very much again, Lana, for joining us, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, Davy. And can I just say how much I've enjoyed all of the talks that have gone before me? They've been so informative, and it's certainly something I'll be bringing into my own teaching. So Andy, can we get my slides up on the big screen? Hang on, I see, maximise. There we go, thank you kindly. So I'm a social psychologist, and I tend to work with excluded groups, so groups that are largely ignored in the research literature. I'm quite interested in people's experiences, their attitudes and prejudices, and to that end I've worked with different groups including victims of crime, prisoners, LGBT groups, homeless folk, people, young offenders, and was a part of one of my most formative research studies, and certainly over the past decade has been working with Gypsy, Traveller and Roma groups. And what we were looking at there specifically was their uptake of immunisation. So there's been excellent information in the past few talks about the real health inequalities, discrimination that Gypsy traveller groups face. And we wanted to look at barriers to immunisations, essentially, to see if we could find some opportunities to remove those barriers. I'll talk more about that multi-year UK-wide study as we go through the slides, but suffice to say just now that this heterogeneity of the idea of that there's one single traveller community. Who I worked with up in Scotland were the Scottish Show people in the East End of Glasgow. So I'm originally from the East End, and I felt very welcome in that community. I also worked with the Romanian Roma and Slovakian Roma in the south side of Glasgow, and it was such a different experience. I'll try and talk to that as we go through, but the groups were so very different there. That wee bit of background just to show you that I'm not an expert in Gypsy travellers. I'm not a gypsyologist. I love that word. That was the first I've heard that earlier. But I love working with groups who are less heard in research, and I hope that kind of sets the scene for what I'm going to speak to you about. Now, I was asked to think about how we might better engage travellers in academic research. And thinking about this, I come up with three main ideas, three main ways. And I would really like to hear what you think about these when we get to our final Q&A. So the first idea was to disseminate research about travellers to various traveller communities in engaging ways, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. I also thought that we should involve travellers more in the design stage of research and participating in research, but also crucially in analysing it and disseminating it on to other people. That takes us kind of back to point one. And thirdly, what I would like to suggest is that we encourage more travellers into university to become academic researchers. So let's have a look at each of those in turn. So first of all, disseminating research about travellers to the community, the travelling communities in engaging ways. Now, we are very good in academia at producing papers, peer-reviewed journal articles. That's our standard, and they're great for professional, for academic audiences, but lay audiences, normal folk, general population, including travellers, might find it very hard to access those papers. They can often be behind paywalls unless you're a university student or a staff member. And also, they can lack interest for lay audiences, and I'm not being patronising there. What I mean is that there's such a lot in academic papers that's all about the method that was used. It's all about permitting replication of the study for other researchers. And so for a lay reader, it's really not of much interest. Maybe the abstract is. Therefore, summary information based on that stringent academic research, so it's still the same information but presenting it in summary ways and relaying it through shareable content, digital content too. This can really have great reach and great impact with our populations of interest. Now, I'm cognizant of the notion of digital exclusion that's been mentioned earlier, and absolutely I would agree that that's something particularly folk that are living on sites and so forth in terms of internet access can be absolutely shocking. But from my own experience, there was a lot of ownership within both the Scottish Show people and the Roma populations in terms of having smartphones, of having access to Facebook and being in WhatsApp groups. And I think that that's something that perhaps we're underutilising as a path to engage people on. Now, for our own study, where we looked at the uptake of immunisations, and all the references and the published papers for that are in these slides, so you can see them, or you can contact me and I'll send you the original papers. What we did is we made this wee video. So I can't show you it during this speech. It's 3.5 minutes long, but hopefully after this, you maybe go and have a wee look at it. You'll see down here on YouTube, can you see it? We're up to like 990 views. So if anyone can go on and get us over 1,000, that would be wonderful. But essentially what this did is it boiled down our 2 years of research, what we found in terms of ensuring that there are proper services for travellers to get their inoculations and so forth. And we put it all into this video. And it was really great in terms of disseminating, giving out that information to the service providers who were working with the travelling communities. I would like to think some of the travellers that took part in the research looked at that too, but I can't say that for sure. But this is something to think about, that in terms of quite dry, stale research output, putting it into a nice video, into a nice infographic, and Pictochart's an excellent place. Yes, please do, Andy, share the link later on. Pictochart's wonderful. Infographics are just like new posh posters, and they're being used absolutely everywhere. I've incorporated it into my coursework with my students as well, because it's a future skill, and it's just a great way of creating a visual output that's got reliable research evidence on it, but in an engaging way that can be shared. Posters, it could be an image online on one of those social media outlets I was talking about. Something we also need to think about in terms of engaging the audiences of interest, the people who were actually studying in these research projects, is to have a greater use of social media. So I know, particularly in the Scottish show people population in Glasgow, and I must say that these were self-defined groups. They gave us these names themselves. That they, especially the young women and the middle-aged women, the mums and the grands, were all very active in Facebook and had groups where they spoke to each other. Indeed, that was one of our problem areas we found for the Scottish show people, is that one of the groups was like an Andrew Wakefield group, scares about the MMR vaccination. So that was something that we found out about there. What you really want to think about is who you're trying to reach. So these ideas that I've got here about disseminating research to travellers, I can see these working with younger people, middle-aged people, people who are maybe interested in news, politics, these sorts of things. I'm not so sure, maybe some older men would be interested, and I'm making assumptions here based on how difficult it was to recruit older men into the Scottish show people sample, and I'll talk about how we managed that too. So think about who you're trying to reach and what's the most appropriate way of doing that. So that was idea one. The research that's already out there about travelling communities, get that fed out to the travelling communities themselves. What do they think about it, and let that feed into the next sort of research projects that we're designing. So that leads us on to my second idea, and emerging from the literature as well, and that is to involve travellers in the design, participation and analysis of academic studies. Now, we're all scrabbling researchers at the moment trying to get funding. It's a very difficult environment, and I know from 2 failed applications in the past year, one to the Wellcome Trust, one to Alcohol Concern UK, that this is now huge. Participatory research, nothing about us without us. If you're studying a group, particularly a marginalised group, you need to have them on board, members of that group from the start, to make sure that you're not making top-down deficits-based assumptions about what it is that they need. What are some of the key ways then that we can involve various people from traveller groups in this? Well, research design, and that's often around the appropriateness of materials. So we might design something and think that's fine to give out, but then it makes no sense, or it works for one group and it doesn't work for the other. And also meaningfulness. It might be that we're trying to collect statistics on something, but if the research has no meaning to the people who are taking part in it, then they don't have ownership of it. They're not truly involved in it. So the research design, having people on from that early stage before you go through the ethics process is really something to aim for. Gatekeeping was hugely important in our UK-wide study on inoculations. We were lucky enough at Cali, at Glasgow Caledonian Uni, that we had a member of the Scottish show people community working. We've got thousands of people at Caledonian. We had one person come forward who was a Scottish show person, and this person was amazing in helping us gain access to the population of interest. And that practically was making introductions. This is Lana, she's a researcher. She wants to learn about what you think about jabs. She's nothing to do with the police or the social work. And these were really important factors. I don't think I would have got anywhere without that gatekeeper. So, and it was about retention too. Attrition is a big problem in research, losing your participants over the course of the study. And our gatekeeper ensured people kept up, they showed up for when we were going to do interviews with them and so forth. Now, Another way we can involve travelling communities. Now this, I could be talking about disabled communities, I could be talking about BAME communities here. This participatory research is all about the particular group of interest. In terms of analysis, the main examples I've seen here of getting participants involved is checking the assumptions you've made when you thematically analyse interviews. So making sure that you've understand what a flatty meant in that context, and when they're talking about living in chalets, and what does that mean, and what's a yard, and so forth, and just ensuring that we have a proper understanding. Really important is stakeholder oversight. So this is the people from the community you're studying themselves. It can also be people that work with them, like health visitors, other trusted people. And you want to have some of these folk on if you have a steering committee for a big research project, a project board, an advisory board. We don't want to all be at the kind of a low level of participation. We want people on the board to be keeping us right and for the avoidance of groupthink, essentially. And then dissemination, which I touched on, and that's feeding that research back, the findings back to the traveller communities. So in an ideal situation, let's say we were doing a research project, I think that it would be great to have a research project on what do Scottish travellers think about university education. And we would have maybe the same people who were participating, helping us design that, then take the findings and through various digital means, try and give those findings back to the traveller community of interest. I've got my eye on the time here, but I just want to touch on this. In our study, I had a real dilemma in terms of paying participants for taking part. And there were such differences in terms of, for me, being the data collector in Glasgow, the Roma communities and the Scottish Show People communities. So in the Show People communities, they were quite insulted sometimes that I was trying to give them a £20 voucher for a supermarket. A couple of them gave me them back and told me to donate them into the project again. Whereas for the Roma side of things, that one of my standout memories in research, so I conducted the Scottish Show People research mainly in their own homes, sometimes in cafes. And with the Roma, it was all in health centres that they accessed, mainly because I needed interpreters and things there as well a lot of the time. But I remember opening up the door to see who had shown up to take part in the focus group that day, and there was just so many people outside from the Roma community all wanting to take part because there was a £20 voucher. So I, as a social psychologist, I can see the ethical dilemma here that you want to, is inducement to participate when you're giving people money that they really need, or are you redressing inequality? If somebody's giving you your time, you should be paying them. So that's just something to think about in the background there. Psychologists love a good ethical dilemma. And thirdly and finally, in terms of these ideas, we want to, and I think this is absolutely crucial, this one would be top of the list for me, encourage more travellers into university to actually become academic researchers. Now, I remember about 3 years ago seeing David Donaldson on the news talking about being the only traveller he knew that was at university at the time and just being absolutely flabbergasted by it. UCAS, so the University Access System, for this year, now I'm just having a wee peek at the side so that I'm not misquoting them in any way. They talk about a widening access student, and we're really great in uni, and over the past few years, we've been really good, successful at getting care experienced children into university and young carers as well. And also those who find themselves in the top 20% of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Now, both of those categories are mentioned on the UCAS site as who is a widening access student, and at the very bottom it says, are from a Gypsy, Roma or traveller background. Do young people know that they could be regarded as a widening access student to get into university, and that would mean that they wouldn't have to have the standard qualifications to get in, but they could get in with the minimum qualifications? Are we not getting that across? How do we pick up on that? I'm also interested in, do you want to focus on travellers in that way? Does that seem quite pejorative, or is it helpful to know that this is a group, a Scottish group that isn't showing up at university, that we're not seeing coming through, and you know about the sort of the impact of university on earnings across a lifetime? I would say that barriers and stigma absolutely do exist. So I would say it's more helpful than pejorative, but I'm not a traveller, so who am I to say? The barriers and the stigma do exist, and they're absolutely exacerbated, particularly by conservative politicians. This has been recorded, I'm not going to mention names, saying things like that we all live in fear of travellers, or unprompted that they want to, hang on, I had written it down, a dream of theirs would be tougher enforcement of travellers and gypsies. And then the news media runs with that, and then the impact that has downstream in terms of prejudice in everyday life. Now, one thing I would say, just in finishing up here, is that we need to ensure that we're not trying to get researchers, academic researchers through uni. So that could be from studying psychology, sociology, it could be economics, and so forth. We don't just want to get travellers into uni so that they can be our resident experts on travellers. They could be that too, but we need to make sure that we're bringing in travellers who want to be nurses, who want to be paramedics, who want to go on and do a medical degree and so forth. And that it's not just that that's their area of expertise. So my final question here is, who are the gatekeepers and the populations and the academics that we need to bring together to try and make this happen, to get more travelling youngsters, adults into uni to get their degrees? Are we doing it today? Is that what this is? Because this has been so useful to me so far. And I think that's something we'll pick up again at the end. Hopefully new contacts are made today and we can start this. Do you want us to come out and give talks to certain youth groups? Who can I find as a gatekeeper to make that happen? Some references here. So I think Davy was mentioning intersectionality among marginalised groups, and that's something that I've just written about in a chapter if anyone wants to look at that. These are all of the papers that relate to our big multi-site Gypsy traveller immunisation study. And you can actually get all of these if you want on this bit here is my actual publications list on the uni website. But please, I've been so excited to hear what you're all talking about today. We want to do more research in this area. I want to know about experiences of prejudice in traveller groups. I want to know about attitudes towards university in traveller groups. Can we make that kind of research happen? So at 12:20, I'll say thank you very much, and I will hand back to Davy. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Lana. It was massively interesting, and yeah, I took down lots of notes myself. Yeah, I think it's such, yeah, and you rightly put it, you know, not just about getting travellers and Gypsy people and Roma into university, it's actually what is the next stage then, you know, how is it going to be meaningful to them? And I think that was a really important point that you brought up there. Okay, I mean, we're into Q&A now, so I'd like to invite our speakers back onto the stage for those of you that have left. We do have one question in the chat, but I would ask all of our amazing attendees, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the question function. This is your chance, and of course that's for any others that you've heard from today. So I'll quickly go to the one question that hasn't been answered yet. It's from Irene, and again, I apologise, Irene, if I'm pronouncing that name wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But they mention, as Davy mentioned in his presentation earlier, there's an ongoing mistrust within the Gypsy traveller communities towards authority. I was wondering what tools or strategies is used to bring those barriers down in order to make sure they have an input in policies going forward. So I don't know who'd like to go first on this one. Elena? Yeah.
Yeah, just briefly, Dom would maybe want to come in afterwards, but this is the key thing that we need to actually work on hugely, because Gypsy travellers are absent from policy and discussion right across Scotland and have been for so long. And you know, you can absolutely understand why there's a huge amount of mistrust there going on generations. If you're, you know, if anybody in any authorities always had the ability to remove your children, to burn your tents, as you said earlier, Davy, that mistrust is, you know, is endemic. And I think it, you know, when I discussed previously about looking for local political champions, we also need to look for champions in third sector organisations and community groups to actually start to break down those barriers. And I was really interested in what Lana was talking about in terms of how you actually find the gatekeepers. And I know, David, you said in the chat, gatekeepers is generally a kind of negative view, and I kind of held that view as well. A gatekeeper is always somebody to me that held people back. But I think as well, from Lana's perspective, and if I'm understanding it correctly, those are about those key people within communities that you need to actually engage with, who are going to give you access to the wider community. So I think there's a lot of work going on to try and figure out how we actually do that engagement. And that's part of the funding that was given to COSLA for Dominic's role is really about that engagement work. And obviously that's at a national level and dissemination through all the local workers and all the local authorities. And one of the first, the community conversations are restarting in December because obviously a lot of it was put on hold for the pandemic. So I think it would be helpful if maybe Dominique comes in to explain how she sees herself taking that role forward. That's okay.
Thanks, Elena. I mean, I think for myself, I suppose kind of speaking for a policy and participation officer kind of hat, and then from a Gypsy Traveller hat, I think the first thing would be in terms of gatekeepers. I would probably just kind of speak to that a bit, and I think it is kind of viewed very much negatively as a word in terms of gatekeepers, and I think the reason for that is that very often when we're speaking about gatekeepers or we're looking for gatekeepers, we can automatically go to organisations who have developed trusted relationships with community members. And I think the pitfall with that is, there's probably a couple of pitfalls with that, and one being that we are only then able to speak to a minority number within the community because it's the people that are engaged with that organisation. And none of this is to obviously kind of decredit any of the really good work that happens with organisations, because obviously that does happen. The other kind of part of that is obviously capacity, and when we just kind of continuously go to organisations, then we kind of hit that kind of capacity issue where the organisations themselves have a limited number of staff, a limited number of hours in which to do the work, so capacity doesn't allow that engagement to happen as proactively as we would need it to. I think the other kind of aspect would be in terms of the Gypsy Traveller community, it's not a hierarchical system, it isn't a hierarchical culture. We don't have a Gypsy King. Davy spoke about historically a man being named the Gypsy King, and there has been people who have kind of taken on the mantle, a kind of spokesperson within the Gypsy Traveller community throughout the years, but it's no any, it's not a kind of position in standing within the community, I suppose. So it's about recognising that we have to speak to the whole of the community, and it's not about kind of individual spokespeople taking responsibility for that. So how do we do it? I mean, the only way I can think is to kind of cut through the red tape. And although Lana kind of spoke about ethical issues and we have to be aware of them, we have to take that into consideration, but we have to go to the community and ask them, how do they want to have this conversation and how do they want to be involved? The biggest thing for me would be immediacy, and I think Davey would agree, but I don't want to speak for him obviously, but a big thing within the Gypsy Traveller community is speak to me about what's happening right now. Don't speak to me about what's happening in 10 years time, because I don't have time for it. So it needs to be what's happening now, and it needs to be what's going to be impactful now. So that's kind of obviously key. That fits quite well with my personality, because I'm very disorganised and I'm very much doing things at the last minute. So when I'm trying to set up the community conversations going forward, I'll be doing that probably very last minute. But my kind of key thing would be asking different individuals within the community to then be taking out the messages into the community further to the people that they know, because I can't know everybody, Davy can't know everybody, a single organisation can't know everybody. We need to be trusting in community members and put them in a position where they are kind of being heard, and there's that kind of open and transparent conversation that they know they're being heard, and it's what they're saying is actually being acted on. The thing with I suppose kind of universities and things like that Lana spoke about, and this is kind of another thing that kind of really impacts negatively in my mind and in relation to engagement with the community, because the Gypsy Traveller community isn't hard to reach. We're everywhere. You know, that we're in most towns in Scotland and other parts of the world, obviously. And again, I'm going to point to Davy, but he's a very good example. The Gypsy Travellers like to talk. Apologies for that, Davy. But the difficulty comes, I suppose, that regardless of how many kind of questionnaires or censuses or whatever are asking people to name themselves as Gypsy Traveller, it's not going to happen, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight, and that's because of the kind of historical prejudice and the current prejudice and discrimination that's happening. My own son is 13, he's just went into second year in high school, and he refuses point blank to tell any of his friends that he's from the Gypsy community, because he hears the conversations and the prejudices that happen indirectly from his friends and from children who are decent children, that they've been brought up well, but nonetheless it happens. So he's fearful of the impact that would have on him within the school. So that's just one example. Lana spoke about kind of different experts from the community. We do have midwives, we do have lawyers, we have activists, we have policy and participation officers. We have many professions that people within the Gypsy Traveller community have pursued and been very successful at, but unfortunately we're not yet in a position where people are always confident enough to name themselves as a Gypsy Traveller. So that's the biggest thing that we have to get over, I think, for me.
Definitely. Thanks for that, Dom. And I suppose you bring us on to our next question that it'd be interesting to hear, Lana, in terms of insights and your research as well on this one. But just briefly, I mean, to echo what Dominique said there, I mean, I went to university. You're right, Lana. I did an interview a while back there. At the time when I was at university, I didn't know any other Traveller men who were at university who would say they were Traveller men. You know, my cousin was at the same, not the same university, sorry, but a university in the same town as me. But she would never, and to this day, she wouldn't say that she was a Traveller. And there's an element, it's important that we don't see that as shame. I think within the community, it can wrongly be assumed that people are ashamed of where they come from, and that's not the case. But actually, and it's crucial to this question as well, is, what do people gain? They know what they are, they know where they come from, and they know what that means to them. But ticking it on a box or being very public about it when they're in a professional capacity, what do we gain from that? So I think we need to be very key on that. And that, again, perhaps plays into this question. But Carol asks, how do we encourage children into primary and high school education so they can then go on into college or university? Our Traveller children do not attend primary school regularly. Perhaps we'll come to Lana first and then open the floor to others to come in on that.
Yeah, and just to say thanks very much to Dominique for the insight there on what you're telling me about that. And I found it so interesting, this idea that gatekeeper is maybe a more negative thing. Oops, are you still there? Can you still hear me? Yeah, I think my video's on. Sorry, I can still talk. That's okay. And what we did is we saw it as someone who was essentially protecting the community from us, from our bungling and going in and doing things wrong and saying the wrong thing, or being inappropriate, or we had this person who helped us get access to the first few people who would come on board to our study, but from then on in we used snowball sampling. So Dominique, that's how we got from just that tiny crew that always wanted to participate, getting to people who really didn't want to talk to us, but we eventually kind of got them in. So yeah, I'll leave that one aside. Is that just very interesting that in academia we see a gatekeeper is quite a positive thing that helps us, and you maybe have more of the medical secretary role, you're not getting in sort of thing about a gatekeeper. So that's quite interesting there. In terms of the schools, I know that at university we go around a lot of the further education colleges and we give talks there, particularly if we've identified, for example, that there are a lot of SIMD 20 students in there and so forth. I have never been asked to do anything with travelling communities, and I would absolutely love to do that. So again, I think it's about us all linking up, seeing what's needed, who would be interested, because I don't just want to go and bore people about university if it's not in their life plans, if it's not what they want for themselves. So I think this is something that we start to take up now between us, if we can, working together to try and get into schools or wherever else people would rather we went to go and speak to them.
Thanks for that, Lana. Would anyone else like to come in on Carol's? Yeah.
Thanks, Davey. Just briefly, it just occurred to me as we were, discussing the question there. I wonder if the Gypsy traveller children that Carol's speaking of are those children that are resident, roadside, or in camps, because I would assume that Gypsy traveller children who are, in settled accommodation are by and large probably attending school under the radar and nobody knows. So I'm wondering what the difference is between, those subsets of children within the travelling community. And it's probably a question for another time, but it just occurred to me as the conversation was happening, as Davey and Dom, pointed out, a lot of people, don't identify overtly, and if they are in settled accommodation, we won't know. And we would just assume that these children are probably in school, because if they're not in school, we would generally know that they're not in school, and we would be following up as to why they're not. So I wonder what the difference is between, those communities who are living on site, or I understand the complexities with living on roadside and not getting access to education. But that's just a question I'm posing, probably not for today, but it just occurred to me.
Just to update slightly before Dom comes in as well, Carol's put in the chat just as sort of enhanced context for you, Elena, off the back of that question. The children are on a traveller's site, 5 minutes walk to the primary school. I'll let Dom come in, but I've got a couple of points on that as well, Carol, that might be useful. Go on, Dom.
I suppose I just kind of want to update for a COSLA perspective on that one, and within the National Action Plan, obviously education is one of the priorities. It has been given less focus in the kind of initial year, because accommodation has been so kind of paramount, and then obviously health has came in this kind of latter stage kind of really strongly in terms of COVID. The reason obviously that accommodation has been given as much focus is because the community have said that is the kind of most important aspect for them at this time. But work is kind of starting to pick up in terms of education, and one of our colleagues from STEP has kind of, I suppose, made steps towards contacting COSLA and Scottish Government to develop a working group to look at how we kind of start to move forward more effectively with the education part of the action plan. And I'm sure she wouldn't mind me kind of given her view, but her view is that we very much need to start to adapt how the education systems kind of sets itself, and that it's flexible and it's changeable to meet the kind of needs and the requirements of the community, as opposed to it being the opposite way about. So that's one thing. For COSLA's point of view, we are going to be trying very hard to involve kind of heads of education throughout the local authorities to become part of the conversations and to start and hopefully move things forward a bit more.
Thank you very much for that, Dom. Just a quick point or two for Carol, perhaps it might help going forward. Dom already highlighted rather STEP, Scottish Traveller Education Programme. I'd highly recommend getting in touch with them if you haven't already. Again, if you need details, they're all on their way. They've got a new Digital Families project, and with that there's a lot of resource online as well that they've recently put up. So I'd link up with them if I were you. I'm interested as well in terms of any past relationship that the school, specifically around outreach, and the school has done with the site, if that has been the case. Was that like? Was that effective? What was the relationship like out of that? And were there any issues with that? Because often cases, especially when it comes to primary school education, of course there's different pressures for secondary and further education, but primary school education tends to be valued within the community for teaching basic skills and numeracy, literacy, reading, writing, these types of things. So it's quite rare that travellers who are settled on a site don't want their children to go to school. It may be a breakdown of relations that's been overlooked. So I'd have a look into that if I were you. And again, STEP can support with all of that. If I'm honest, they do quite a lot of work, and depending on where the site is, there might be a third sector partner as well who is working there. Okay, go on, Dom. Sorry. Yep.
So, sorry, it was just to kind of point out as well that one of the and it's kind of referring back to some of Ilana's presentation in terms of getting Gypsy travellers into kind of adult education and further education. And one of the difficulties that's been pointed out is that, as we know, and as Davey's pointed out there, that primary school is kind of viewed within the community as very important in terms of setting out the initial skills and kind of building on them. Very often within the Gypsy Traveller community, kids won't go after the age of 12, they won't move on to high school, and that's for various reasons. That's for the discrimination, that's for the fear, that's for how they will be impacted on through mixing with the settled community, and you know, kind of differences of opinion in terms of lessons that they will be taught through the curriculum. One of the issues that comes along with that is that if a child does not register with secondary school, they're then missing for the education system. So there's no way you kind of picking them back up again, I suppose. And then when we look at further education, if a Gypsy Traveller child, maybe at the age of 15 or 16, decides, no, actually I want to make my own decision and I want to go into further education, where do they start with that? Where do they go? Do you know, they're coming with a primary school education, but there isn't anything in place currently to allow them to access the right type of knowledge, education or qualifications to get into further education.
Thanks for that, Dom. Lana, yeah, do you want to come in?
Very, very briefly, that's an excellent point that you make there, Dom, and I think that we need research around that gap at secondary school, because it's with the research we get the evidence base to say, here's an intervention that might help. If we provided this type of education here for this group, if we work out what the problems are and deal with them one by one, can we somehow improve that situation? So I think that's an excellent steer you've given me in terms of me on my reading now, in terms of, would it be like a catch-up education you would be looking for? Would it be an alternate way of delivering education? And one of the few positives I think we can say that's come out of COVID is that universities are now far more flexible. We're delivering everything online. We're ready to do that for next trimester if necessary. We're ready to go back to blended or face-to-face. And we've got all year to run trimesters in. I know from our own inoculation study that summer was a really difficult time for folk to get appointments for their kids' jabs because they were travelling. And it might be that for young travellers, we need to shift the academic year for them somehow and make it more appropriate. So these are conversations I would love to have. I don't want to take up the rest of the time, but it was just, thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks again, Lana, for feeding back on that. I completely agree. More research, the better. There's some work getting done at STEP, leading on it, not plugging my own project or anything, but might be worth linking up after this around gap in education. So lastly, I'd like to come to Christine's point, and quite articulately brings back to the notion of place and how practically these things work. So Christine says, I noted that involving the Gypsy traveller community in local plans was mentioned. I think they're referring to Kevin's points that he made around that. This would involve bringing both the Gypsy traveller community together with the settled communities looking for a local place plan. How could this best be done? So it perhaps ties into that Elena and Dom and Lana have already made in terms of working with in a meaningful way, but is there anything else anyone would like to feed in? Elena, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to actually bring something that Dom said into it as well. I mean, she said about don't ask me, something in 10 years' time, ask me about things that are going to impact me just now. And I think that's probably the impacts on place plans and using the place standard tool for not just Gypsy travelling communities, but for the general community at large. And I found it really difficult sometimes to actually engage different groups of people within the settled community to engage with the place standards tool and then to feed into the local place plans. So I think that there's going to have to be concerted work across the board on this. And I think that once we start to break down the barriers and get people more engaged, it might not be this iteration of local place plans that are going to, to capture all of that rich data and information. It might be the next iteration of them. And I think we have to work towards that. But it's always difficult to get people to recognise their place in these forward planning issues, because it's not the here and now. It's not addressing the the substandard conditions that they're living with. It's actually about how do we address these inequalities going forward, make sure that people have culturally and collectively resourced. I know that the Minister keeps talking about that, but until we actually do the bigger pieces of work to understand what we need, and that's where the research money comes into it, that's where all the community engagement comes into it. If we do things too quickly, I think we're actually not going to deliver what the big aspirations are that we have. So there has to be a lot of time that's taken in this. So I don't think there's any quick fix for how we do that work in terms of local place plans. I think we're going to have to continue to engage with that over the next few years until the next iteration of local development plans. But it's something that I'm certainly really focused on, and I know that once I leave COSLA, that's not going to stop, but that focus is still going to be clearly there.
Thanks for that, Elena. Emma, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Davey. I was just going to make a general point, I suppose, about engagement and encourage people to go back to the national standards for community engagement and really the basics of community engagement and community development work, and to, if it's not something you're comfortable with, to bring in those who are, because we've got obviously a community sector who have got huge experience in community engagement that we can work with and learn from. The place standard itself is an engagement tool, but it's just a tool, and you need the quality of the interaction and the information you get depends on how you use it. And we would always say to use the place standard alongside the national standards for community engagement to make sure that you're getting the right people involved and engaging them in an accessible way. And I suppose in terms of that here and now, making it about things that matter to people. So rather than say, come and tell us about local place plan, get a bit of a sense of what the key issues are locally already for Gypsy travel communities and for settled communities and the things that cross-cut, and then make it about how are we going to work together to address these, maybe through a local place plan or through another mechanism, but talk about the issues rather than talking about the kind of the things that planners and policymakers talk about, which are often not the words or anything meaningful to communities. So a few things to just sort of think about for anyone looking at doing engagement like this. And the national standards are online, and you can look at them and you can see how to use them and engage with the kind of community development sector in your local area if you need support around that. Would be my top tip.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Emma. And I suppose just to echo a little bit of what you said, but often when it comes to engagement and when it comes to these forward planning elements within any community, especially marginalised communities, we need to go back to, I don't want to get too academic, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you're facing severe issues with getting clean running water, for example, on some of these sites, you're not going to want to think about whether you're going to build a park in 10 years' time. We need to be really to the point with things and quite direct, I think, with that. Well, thank you all very much. We've went over time a little bit, but I think it was important to get those last couple of questions answered for everyone. Again, thank you so much to all of our amazing speakers. I know you're not all here, I think Petra's off, but thank you all. And thank you again to everyone here for those questions as well. I hope it was useful to everyone. It was certainly insightful to me, and I've got a load of notes to go forward. What we're really keen with is that this isn't just a knowledge sharing session, but actually it's about building partnerships. So please do take, I know a few of the speakers shared their contacts in their slides, but Andy will as well share details with speakers and with audience members. So please do use this as an opportunity to link up with your practice, take an intersectional approach to issues, but most importantly, be solution focused and action focused. Time and time again from our speakers today, we've heard that reiterated that we need action, we need things to tangibly change and solutions to be built. So I found that really refreshing, if I'm honest, and hopefully the rest of the audience did as well. So thank you all very much for coming. Just checking my chat, see if Andy's, no, that's fine. I think I've covered everything. Please do follow Paz on Twitter. They do great projects as well as all of our amazing speakers. So thank you all very much and take care.
Davey.